Shabbat Shalom. Had a good, interesting day already. We're going to go to Numbers 14. Those of you here last year, this is really in the middle of a story. Last week we kind of started the story, and this time we're going to finish the story. And I'm going to read some of the chapter. I don't know that I'll read all of it. As we mentioned last time, the story, like all Bible stories, is an old story. It took place probably about 3,400 years ago. But like all Bible stories, it's very contemporary. Sometimes you can see yourself in the stories and you're glad, and sometimes you're sad when you see yourself in the story. Then all the congregation lifted up their voices and cried, and the people wept that night. All the sons of Israel grumbled, there's a word for you, grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt?" So they said to one another, "Let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt." Remember what happened last time. They sent 12 spies into the land, one leader for each tribe. They looked over the land and then brought back a report. What we mentioned last time is their job was to go see what the land was. Their job was not to decide whether or not to go. They took a new job. God said, "This is your inheritance." It's like somebody gave you a gift. You went and looked at it and said, "I don't want it." And this is what happened. They said, the land is large, big people, walled cities, and we can't take it. And so they start saying weird stuff, like, "We wish we'd have died in Egypt, or we'd died in the wilderness," which of course is not what they really wanted. Then Moses and Aaron fell on their faces in the presence of all the assembly of the congregation of the sons of Israel. Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh, all those who had spied out the land, tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, saying, "The land which we passed through to spy out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against Yahweh, and do not fear the people of the land, for they will be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." But all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Then the glory of Yahweh, the glory of the Lord, appeared in the tent of meeting to all the sons of Israel. Yahweh said to Moses, "How long will this people spurn me? And how long will they not believe in me, despite all the signs which I have performed in their midst? I will smite them with pestilence and dispossess them, and I will make you into a nation greater and mightier than they." When did the people spurn the Lord? And when did they not believe him? It's an interesting, because what did the people spurn? The land. They spurned the inheritance. They spurned what God was bringing them to. And God took that as, "They're spurning me." And so the Lord says he's going to destroy them, and you all know this is a famous story. Moses says, "The Egyptians will hear of it, for by your strength you brought them out." And then they'll say, "The inhabitants of the land, that you weren't able to bring them into their inheritance." And it goes on. And in verse 17, Moses says, "But now I pray, let the power of the Lord be great, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness, forgiving iniquity and transgression. But he will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, to the third and fourth generations. Pardon, I pray, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of your loving kindness, just as you have also forgiven this people from Egypt, even until now." So the Lord said, "I have pardoned them according to your word." Isn't that interesting? The Lord pardoned them according to whose word? Moses. Moses' word. But indeed as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of Yahweh, the glory of the Lord. Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he has a different spirit and has followed me fully, I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. Then it talks about where the Amalekites and the Canaanites are, and then there's a judgment on the people. For every day that the spies spied out the land, they will spend a year in the wilderness. So they were 40 days spying out the land, 40 years they'll be in the wilderness. And those who said that they would lose their wives and their little ones, God says, I'll take your little ones in, but you will all die in the wilderness. And so the refusal to go into the inheritance became, they got their answer to their prayer. They are not going to go. It will not be available to them, but God would take their children in. And I brought out to you last time something, if you look in verses 36 and 37, as for the men whom Moses sent out to spy out the land, who returned and made all the congregation grumble against him by bringing out a bad report concerning the land, even those men who brought out the very bad report of the land died by a plague before Yahweh. This is the exact same Hebrew terminology that we find in the story of Joseph, where he brought a bad report against his brothers. And I bring this out to people because in Hebrew it's not a bad report, it's bad slander. Wouldn't you all agree with me that in English, report is a neutral word? You bring a report, and so when I hear a good report or a bad report, I'm thinking that, it's a report. The Bible does not say it's a report. It says it's slander. It says it's libel. And so the word is dibah, ra'ah, or ra, which is, ra just means evil. And dibam or dibatam has to do with this shaky, uncertain character that we see in slander or libel, where the intent is to destabilize. The intent is to change people. Why did the 10 bring back their report? Because they did not want to go face the Canaanites. So the purpose of the report was to turn people from God's purpose. Then the next paragraph talks about the people woke up in the morning and they said, we've made a terrible mistake. So we're going to go up and take the land. And Moses said, don't do that, because God won't be with you. And you'll find several stories throughout the taking of the land where the Lord says, I'm not going with you. It never turns out well. They were attacked and destroyed. And the Bible mentions that God didn't go with them and the ark didn't go with them. But they still went up. Now, I want to spend just a little time talking about what this means about taking the land and your inheritance, because every human being has an inheritance. Every human being has a call. It's often tied to the land. In fact, I'm guessing that most of you, when you see the flag of the United States of America, you feel something. If you don't, you're strange, really. Because it's a banner, it's a picture of the land where you dwell and your connection and your identity. And one of the sad things about our land, and I might touch on this later, may not, is that in asserting our right to this land, we removed the people who were native to this land. And if you read the Bible, there's a price to pay for that. Because God, Sakina, when he's here, he mentioned this, and if you go back and read Acts 17, it brings it out very carefully, that God determined the times and the places and the boundaries of your habitation. So if you were born in a particular place, a part of a particular people, that was part of God's plan. And for Israel, they were born in Egypt, but they weren't Egyptians. They knew that. That was a constant thing that their fathers handed down to them. Our inheritance is over there. That we are going to go, actually not there, we're going to go east. east and north. And one of the things I think is very important, and some Christians have lost sight of this, in our belief, we have spiritual truths we cling to, and we have physical truths. These must be connected. If we separate the physical from the spiritual, we get strange. And this is why this is my opinion, of course. You pray and look at the Bible. A Christian cannot support the BDS movement against Israel, in my opinion. Of course, you can need to check it out and see for yourself. Because this movement says that the Jews do not have a right to the land. 100 times in the Torah, it says that's their land, all of Israel's land. It's repeated over another 100 times in what we call the rest of the Old Testament, what Jews would call the Tanakh. And for those of us who believe in Yeshua, do you know what it says in 2 Corinthians 1? It says, as many promises as God has made, they are yes in Jesus. Yes in Yeshua. Which means every promise from Genesis to Revelation is yes in the Messiah. So as we start this, there's a physical aspect to the inheritance that cannot be dismissed. If it's all spiritual, we get weird. We get strange. In fact, you'll have people say things like, you know, God made that physical promise, but all that physical stuff has gone away. But let's take that to its logical conclusion. That means I can't commit spiritual adultery, which is to worship other idols, but physical adultery is okay because now we're living in the Spirit. How does that sound for stupid? I hope it sounds really stupid. When we grumble and complain about our inheritance, about what God has given us, and we all do it, we hit spots in our life where we don't like what God's given us. But that's speaking against God. And in the end, if we want to be whole, we repent and turn around and endorse what God has given us. It's just one of those things that when we're fighting against the inheritance God has given us, we are not at peace in our souls. And we also will say things we don't mean. Can you imagine, was there any person in the camp of Israel that really believed that they wanted to die in Egypt or die in the wilderness? No, all their complaints were about because they were afraid they might die. When we are protesting against God, we usually don't make sense, and we usually do stupid things and say stupid things. And it didn't just happen 3,400 years ago. I have personal experience that it still happens today. Another thing you find out, and it's a good, don't you love in this story, and I think God's just testing Moses, but I don't have the mind of God, I don't know. But when he comes to Moses and he says, I'm going to wipe him out and start over. And Moses says, but this would be, in the eyes of the nations, something that would profane your great name, your reputation. And Moses also reminds the Lord that when the Lord showed himself to him, he said, I'm the great and compassionate God, the loving and forgiving God. And Moses said, this is who you are. The Lord says, sure, I'll forgive him. Because that's who I am. And it's a good thing God does that. But if you look at Scripture, one of the things that God is very harsh upon, which cost the people here, didn't it? Because they refused to go, they didn't get to go. God still fulfilled his promise. He took their children in. But they cost themselves that right. When I was a kid, there were scriptures I memorized. Because frequently they'd get up, they'd say, all right, kids, they'd go down, everybody had to say a scripture. Well, so we learned some. Rejoice evermore. Jesus wept. If you didn't do, we got good at this. The only problem is if you were 10th in a row, you had to have some other ones. Those all got used up. Another one was remember Lot's wife. And why did Yeshua say to remember Lot's wife? What did Lot's wife do? She looked back. Her inheritance wasn't in Sodom And God was rescuing her from there, but she couldn't stand to leave. And that this picture, and it's interesting, if you go to the Dead Sea today, there are all these salt pillars around, which they call, of course, Lot's wife. But you have this picture of the 40 years in the wilderness, Lot's wife, and then this is another scripture that my mother hammered into us. And I'll bet you can finish it for me, and I get all the versions mixed together. Whosoever that puts his hand to the plow and looks back is what? Not fit for the kingdom of God, right? Something like that. We probably have 40 versions represented here. But what is that? What's Yeshua? What's Jesus saying there? He's saying that once you've set your face to go, you go until you drop. And if you're by yourself or 10 million, you go. And this is a very consistent theme in Scripture. And it's hard for humans. I don't know about the rest of you. I find I want to see a crowd following me or be with the crowd. I want to feel like I'm not alone. This is a difficult thing that people face, but part of accepting your call and your inheritance is that sometimes it is lonely. Can you imagine how lonely it was to be Moses? When I think about Moses, I think, what an incredible person. And then we also have all these stories about people who despised the inheritance, is the way the Scripture defines it. And who's the person that immediately leaps to your mind when you say despise the inheritance? Esau. Wouldn't you agree that's the one most of us will think of? Why? Because when Esau's been out hunting, he's hungry, he's famished, he comes, Jacob is preparing food, and he says, "Can I have some of that?" And of course, what does Jacob say? Yeah, he says, "I'll give you some if I can have the birthright." Remember what Esau says? "What's the birthright to me? I'm hungry." And this is a picture, at least to me, that you have to be careful about physical appetites, because physical appetites are beautiful things under the control of the Spirit. They're wonderful things when they're in our control. If they control us, they destroy us. Whether it's the appetite for food, sex, power, I don't care what it is, under the power of God, it's a great thing. It's a horrible thing when it runs you. Gerald, I think you had your hand up.
I was just thinking about both Esau and the report of the spies. If you're uncertain or uncomfortable, the unknown positive can never win against the unknown negative. The negative will tie you down every time because you're not sure that there's value on the other side. Mm-hmm. And it was so easy. I mean, Caleb and Joshua give this great glowing report and encourage everybody. And all those other people had to do was throw up that specter of, we're going to get wiped out.
That was it. That's a good point, Gerald, because if we allow the negative to come in and we start imagining, because let's be honest, aren't we imagining that they'll destroy us? We don't know that. But how many of you have failed something because you started worrying about the possibility? I mentioned to you last time about somebody I know who went clear through the licensed practical nurse training and didn't take the test because of her fear of failing. And she was very competent. And it cost her, I don't know how many thousands of dollars, because she went into home care. She was excellent at it. But because she couldn't put LPN next to her name, she cost herself a lot of money because of the fear of something. She didn't fail the test because she didn't try. Believe me, that is very human. To sit, like you said, Joe, weigh and measure the potential negative, and it fills us up. And when you think about Esau, one of the books I'll think about is Malachi, because Malachi talks about, it's a specific word to the priests, and it says, priests, you're acting like Esau. You have been given me for your inheritance, and you're sniffing at it. You're contemptuous of me. And most of the book is about that. But at the end of the book, it's to all of Israel. It's all of God's people. And it says in verse 4 of chapter 4, remember the law of Moses my servant, even the statutes and ordinances which I commanded him in Horeb for all Israel. The law, the Torah, the instructions were Israel's inheritance, right? This is what he gave them. It was specifically to Levi because their job was to communicate it to the people so that the people knew. And you'll notice in times of backsliding and revolt, like 1 Chronicles 15, it talks about for a long time Israel was without the true God and without a teaching priest. What's so important about a teaching priest? To remind people we have a covenant with God. We have a thing that says, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. These are the covenant. When Israel forgot the covenant, they would drift away. So God says, remember the instructions I gave Moses. Law is not a great translation, but we don't have a different one. But really, the word Torah is more teaching and instruction than it is law. And if you read in Proverbs, it will talk about the law of your mother. But no one translates it that way because it doesn't make sense. So it says the instruction. It's the same word. Behold, I'm going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. What will Elijah do? I'll bet you all know. He's going to restore what? The hearts of the fathers to the children and the children to the fathers. What is this saying? He's going to bring us to the inheritance. Because when I'm united to my fathers and I'm connected to my sons, we're in the land of our inheritance. We're home. And when we cut ourselves off from our fathers or cut ourselves off from our posterity, we get out of our place. And so Elijah's job is to come and restore the hearts of the fathers to the children to the fathers, or what happens? I will come and what? I'll come and smite or strike the land with a curse. And in Exodus 15, you don't need to turn here, it's just a short verse. It says, you will bring them and plant them in the mountain of your inheritance, the place, O Lord, which you have made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, O Lord, which your hands have established. And the interesting thing about the connection to the land and the inheritance is it is not necessarily connected to religious feeling. God is at the base of it. But I remember our guide, the first time I went to Israel in 1987, this was when the first intifada was starting to smolder with Arafat. And our guide, his name was Johnny Bauer. He spoke English with a very British accent because he had been born in Austria in the Holocaust, but his parents escaped and went to England. So he grew up in England. And he opened his mouth and he sounded British. It's kind of funny. But he described, he was a very secular Jew. He didn't know whether or not he believed in God. And his idea of heaven on earth is when a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew worship together without killing each other. I've come to see he's a wise man. But he talked about, he was part of the forces that went in and liberated Jerusalem in 1967. And he said he was totally unprepared. Their tanks came over the hill, and the men saw the walls of Jerusalem, and they all broke down crying. Had nothing to do with, it was this connection to the land. There's the fathers to the sons and the sons to the fathers. And to hear him describe that, my heart leaps within me again because I just knew it comes from God. There's a connection to the land. There's a connection to the inheritance. It's not a bad thing. And you know, on July 4th, we celebrate the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and you know, whether that's the 2nd or the 4th, you know, there's these little defugiles. But there's a scripture that's often read. In Leviticus 25, verse 8, you are to count off 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, so that you have the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years, namely 49 years. You shall then sound a ram's horn abroad on the 10th day of the 7th month. On the day of atonement you shall sound a horn through your all through your land. You shall thus consecrate the 50th year, and proclaim a release through the land to all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. What do most translations say? Proclaim liberty throughout the land. What's liberty? Going home. The very basis of our democracy comes out of this scripture that says, when the horn is blown, proclaim a release or liberty and return to your inheritance. Return, because in God's eyes, the person that has been removed from their inheritance because they were broke, sold into slavery, conquered, they're never really free till they come home to the place of their inheritance. The inheritance is everything to God. If you don't see that, the Bible won't make sense. And the things Paul says won't make sense because he's constantly talking about coming home to your inheritance. And you think about it, the Lord says here in Leviticus 25, it's a jubilee, it shall be holy to you. It's a time of celebration. It's not an accident that that's on the Liberty Bell. Proclaim liberty throughout the land to all its inhabitants. And we find freedom home in our inheritance. And I love Psalm 137, and I wrote a little song to it. But this psalm says, by the waters of Babylon, we sat and we wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps. How can we sing the song of the Lord in a foreign land? And it's a gripping, poignant psalm because the children of Israel are in Babylon and they're being asked to sing and they can't because they're not home. When you think about the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that what? They are endowed by their Creator with what? Certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our concept of freedom in this nation is built on the fact that God gave us rights. That God gave us an inheritance. Why is this important? Because if I don't give you your rights, I can't take them away. What's interesting, I've been reading this book called Team of Rivals. It's 850 pages. Fabulous book. It's about Lincoln and the guys that were very instrumental in Civil War and bringing this country to where, at least in some ways, repudiated slavery. The history of slavery will make you sick. I've got numerous books, and I probably haven't read 0.1% of the books. But I had missed before because I've been reading about Lincoln and Douglas and their debates. And Douglas got up in his debates and he said this. He read that line, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he said, the framers did not intend this to apply to Negroes, is the word he used, and Indians. And I thought, whoa, that's awful. And then I went, whoops, I've heard that today. I've heard that today. I heard somebody get up and say that an 8-month-old fetus that has the ability to feel pain, that has the ability to feel emotion, is not covered by this because I said so. The Civil War was fought about over people saying that if it says all men are created equal, it means all men. It means all Homo sapiens created in the image of God. And when we start limiting who that reaches, when we start limiting other people's ability to enter their inheritance, we keep ourselves out of our inheritance. And it's just interesting to see. Because when the Germans first came here, people weren't sure they were included. The Irish were certainly not included when they first came because they were Catholics. And the Catholics were not included in this. Isn't it amazing that these inspired words were written that come right out of Leviticus 25, and then every people group has had to fight to be a part of the definition? And I'm telling you today that one of the things that we'll see, if God lets us live here long enough, the abortion battle will be over because something will happen. People will finally wake up and go, how can we say that people aren't people? You know, it's amazing. But it happened before, it could happen again. In fact, you know, one of the things I was thinking, we blessed 2 babies today. Do you like anything more than blessing babies? It's my favorite thing. You know, one of my favorite things is seeing different races bless their babies. And we're all one. We're created equal. We're not different people. We're the same people. We're just, you know, it's interesting. All these people fighting over this back in the Civil War, you read the stuff they said, even the, quote, enlightened people, and it makes you want to vomit. Because they were convinced that blacks were inferior and would never really deserve the right to vote. And so everybody would say this on both sides, well, they shouldn't be treated as property, but, you know, they're inferior, so they'll never be able to vote. They'll never be, you know, all this. And of course, today we're just disgusted. The same thing will happen. The truth has this way of grinding through history slowly, slowly, and people will go, you know what? They're people. If they're people, they have to be treated the right way. When you look at the inheritance, what I would challenge all of you to do, because, you know, sometimes we think, well, why am I where I am? Well, guess who put you where you are? God. You're not there accidentally. But I sat down and took a minute and kind of wrote some of my history. And I would challenge you to do that too, because you're not here by accident. You're not in the place that you are by accident. The things, the events that have happened to you are not accidental. God has a purpose in them. God will use them for you. And I remember the story of Naboth, who when Ahab, you know, Naboth is the anti-Esau. Do you all understand that in Scripture? Esau says, what's my inheritance to me? Give me the soup, or worse yet, lentils. At least do it for ice cream or a banana split. That may not be in the Scripture, but it just occurred to me. But when Ahab came to Naboth, and he says, I need your land. I want to build a vineyard there. He says, I'll pay you for it. And Naboth said, far be it from me to sell the inheritance of my fathers. I cannot do it. And so, you know what, Ahab went home and sulked on the bed. Jezebel says, buddy, did you forget you're the king? And they orchestrated this horrible plan. Naboth and his sons were killed. You know what's awesome? Is that when Elijah comes back, you know what he does? He sounds forth his trumpet, and Naboth's children come back to their inheritance. Our inheritance never goes away. And I was thinking about my family. My grandma and grandpa are Swiss. We're Swiss. And they converted to the Mormon church, and that's another big, long story, while they were in Switzerland. This all took place in the end of the 1800s. My grandpa Carl, everybody in the U.S. called him Charlie, and my grandma Sophia came from 2 different religious streams. The Kuntzes, Charlie Kuntz, came from what we call the Reformed Presbyterian line, where the Latterners, Sophia, came from the Catholic line. When they converted to Mormonism, they started to experience some subtle and some more overt persecution. So they had decided they were going to get married, but they were going to come to the U.S., to Zion, to get married and raise their family. And so they came over in 1901, and they came through Portland, didn't they, Sharon? Portland. Yep, Portland. It wasn't, what's the other famous one? Yeah, but they came through Portland. Anyway, in fact, Sharon found the entry, Carl and Sophia Kuntz, 1901. They came here with no money. I mean, how would you have money? They went to Salt Lake. They hadn't been here very long, probably a year. Grandma had had Uncle Hank Henry in 1903, just a baby. And the church called Charlie to go to the Appalachians, to this German-speaking people, on a mission. They didn't have any money. He cheerfully assented. He goes on his mission, leaving Grandma by herself with a little baby, and she supports herself, the baby, and Grandpa by taking in washing for other people. They were happy to do it. As you can imagine, my dad grew up a very committed Mormon. There were some differences in the family because they also went to Metropolis. Anybody that's ever been there, there was a United Order community there. And my grandpa just threw in everything to be a part of that. Well, the bishop ended up being a crook and took all the families. And so my dad's older brothers hated the Mormon church. Dad loved it. He was committed to it. He went to Brazil on a mission in, I think it was 38 through 40. It was in there someplace, which means he'd have been about 22. He came back, went through the war, of course, went to BYU and got his degree. And he did this in a little over a couple of years because he was able to test out of some things, and like a lot of people then, worked night and day, went to school, and then he went up to, I think it was Eugene. He and Lloyd went up there and got his MBA and went back to San Francisco, the Bay Area, Richmond, a whole bunch of different places. But in all this, he had this commitment to the Mormon church, and he had this great desire, to work in this field. I've never figured out, I see this in my own boys. I know I'm related to Dad. He's my dad. But accounting? Oh. And that's what my kids think when they go, veterinary work? Needles, blood? What's wrong with you? Dad's dream job, the thing he yearned to be, was the controller for BYU. It would allow him to serve the church and to be at the top of his profession. It was everything he ever yearned to be. If you can believe it, he was called to this job. They said, we'd like you to do the job. You meet all the requirements. And then they discovered something that wasn't so good. His wife wasn't Mormon. And they hashed over this, went back and forth. And finally they came to Dad and they said, it's fine if we'll hire you, and there's no problem with your wife. She just has to agree not to talk about her faith. Mom, not so sure about that. If you can imagine, this was the dream of his life. He went to bed sick. He was deathly sick. After I don't know how many days. Got up one day and went to Mom and he says, you know what? If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for me. And he turned down the job. A few years later, he was hired by a company on the American Stock Exchange called Gore Oliver. They functioned in big equipment. I don't even know what they did because all this was very boring to me. We moved to Connecticut in '56. We lived there for a couple of years, and Dad was very good at his profession. If you knew my dad, good with people, good with numbers. He just went up the ladder. And another thing my dad liked to do, and you probably all heard him say, he just loved the feeling of the tires under him. He liked to travel. He liked to go places. And after we'd been there a couple of years, and he was going to New York University, taking some classes, working on some further schooling in his field, when he was offered a huge promotion in Gore Oliver, and the whole family would move to London. Dream job again. The absolute thing that he would have, if he could pick a job to go someplace else in the world. Bishop writes Mom and Dad a letter and says, will you come teach school in the desert? Well, you have to realize Dad knows what this desert looks like. He grew up in McGill. He drove his dad through this valley because his dad was the stake president and a lousy driver. Dad said it was terrifying to have Grandpa drive. And Grandpa knew it, so Dad would do the driving. And Grandpa was a very bright fellow, but he went through third grade. And so Dad would do his typing. Dad did a lot of stuff for Grandpa. But Dad knew what this was, and Dad met Mom in McGill. Mom knew what was here. And so Dad said, here, this is happening again. But he said, you know what? If the house sells, but when the house sells, then we can do it, because real estate was absolutely not moving at that time. This was in 1958. So they put their house on the market, and it sold the next day. And they got $2,000 more for it than they paid for it, which I know you'll be astounded to know was $24,500. That house today is worth $700,000. It really isn't, but that's what it's listed. It was being sold. Somebody showed a picture of it. But so we come out to the desert, and here's this strongly committed Mormon living out in a strange little community. Another thing, if you know about my dad, there's nothing he loved more than trees and grass. We were kind of in short supply when we got here. And I've always thought, how did Dad do all this? And I can tell you something that I realized when I was thinking about it, is Dad's heart was on the inheritance. And wherever it took him, whatever it cost him, that's where he was going. And so he came out here and he taught school, grades 5 through 8. And anybody that ever had my dad for a teacher, he's an awesome teacher. He's a good teacher. But that really wasn't his first choice in life. He went back to the U and got a doctor's degree in education, supervised student education. He was awfully good there. Voted best dressed man on campus. I mean, my dad was kind of an unusual person. That first summer we're here in 1959, he and Mom go in to Provo. All our family did, and we lived across the street from Claude and Bertha Waite. There's an old piano shop right there, some of you might remember. And I can still remember, my dad's a Mormon, but he's going through all this, he's helping out, and I think we were holding church in Claude's house. I'm not even sure. I know the Springville church wasn't there yet. Wherever we had services in the area, but I'm pretty sure, it seems like it was in Claude's house. Dad gets up in testimony meeting, he says, I thought, this is interesting. I always loved to hear him talk. He's a great speaker. And he started to talk. He says, the Lord's been working on my heart. He says, I'm going to be baptized in the house of Aaron. And I can still remember. I'm 8 years old, and I'm thinking, heaven's come to earth, because I don't know how many of you have lived in a religiously divided house. Not my favorite thing. Within 10 years, Dad's the chief high priest. Bishop passed away in October of '69. And whatever else you think about all this, and I was thinking about this in terms of its impact on me, I realized that one person's life has such a huge impact on everyone else. What would all of our stories be without this story? And what you have to realize, all of your stories are just as impactful as this one. Who blends this all together and makes this beautiful tapestry? God does. And has He given us a good inheritance? He's given us a wonderful inheritance. We are so blessed. But I'm serious. I have not been good at keeping track of stories. And my dad wouldn't talk about himself. It drives me crazy to this day. What we learned to do was start asking him things and get the stories out of him. Now, I talk about myself all the time. My poor kids are sick of my stories. And my mom was good about talking about things, but Dad, it was drag it out with a... But seriously, your children and your grandchildren, they want to know your story. They want to know how God worked in your life to bring you to the place that you are, to treasure the inheritance that you have. The people that are part of it, the events that are part of it, and above all, to embrace what God's given you, the regrets and all this other stuff that we deal with, to ask God to wash them away, because all they do is serve to take away the joy that we have right now. What's right in front of us? I see our time is up. Yeshua said something, and I'll finish with this. And it hit me because sometimes I felt, Lord, it's lonely following you. For me sometimes. And then I realized it's no more lonely than He's called it to be. And what the Lord does is good. And Yeshua, they came to Him and they said, there's some Greeks that want to speak to you in John 12. And He answers this in such an odd way. He says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. He says, truly I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls in the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. And it struck me that this is the pattern I've seen my whole life, is that people that understood what Yeshua said, if you'll give your life away for my sake, you'll find it. That I've seen this over and over. The people I consider pillars of my faith. Ones yet alive, ones who have gone on, who I understand I stand on their witness. But as I watch them give their lives away, I see increase. I see fruitfulness. I see the joy and the abundance of what God does. And so I'm saying, Lord, in you I'm not afraid to die, whatever that means. Whatever that means to give myself up, because as I look around me, those who gave themselves, who poured out every last drop, all it did was come back 100-fold. So I'm very grateful today, and I pray that my sharing in some way helps you to see what a wonderful inheritance God has given you, wherever you are. And that those of you who are in the house of Levi and Aaron, hang on to what God has given you, if it's by the last fingernail on your little finger. Don't let go, because God will honor that. And God will bring you and us to His place. Let's all stand. Sister Karma, would you close for us, please?
I want to thank you for this beautiful day you've given us to come here and to do it in service. We thank you for everything that's taken place so far and everything message we have received. And Lord, we just ask that you will solidify that in our minds and in our hearts, that we will remember these wonderful things you've done for us all of our lives, and how you still are watching over us. And we just pray for you. To live us throughout this years for us on this day. We just praise you, Lord. Thank you, you're so good. We love you. We just